beginning, there is Orpheus. Orpheus, the mythological innovator who established love among men. In the world of art and mythology, the first gay individual is Orpheus. Orpheus, who brought a previously divine prerogative down to earth, that prerogative, gay love. Although most often seen as the monogamous spouse of Eurydice, Orpheus abandons the love of women for that of men. Let's now turn from the realm of Orpheus and mythology to the realm of art. My name is Tom Sokolowski, and I'm an art historian.
I think he wanted us to embrace art in the broadest sense possible.
He was a friend of art. He was an artist. And he would never say that.
I guess provocateur is one word that I would use, but he was also kind of an agitator. Like he wanted to change things.
He wanted to break barriers, and he wanted to piss people off.
He had a backbone of real steel, and he made it count.
If you paid any attention to Tom at all, you would realize what an extraordinary queen he was, and what delight he got in that.
And at that point, it was still a little more controversial to be so openly gay.
We're all carrying all that stuff with us where we were going to be the people who were going to change the world, and it sort of made us fearless.
Tom 100% knew that he had the responsibility to make sure that social justice issues were not only addressed but amplified.
He was the most proud of the work he did surrounding AIDS and connecting art to a virus.
There would be lines to get into the openings at the Gray Gallery when Tom did shows.
I think that what they saw in him was someone who had a lot of energy and that was going to put this museum, the Zimmerli Art Museum, on a sort of international stage in a similar way that he had done both at the Gray Art Gallery and then also at the Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh.
He fought a lot of Goliaths. And he, to my way of thinking, he won.
Tom and I met at the Institute of Fine Arts of New York University. I guess it was 1973.
Tom could talk to anybody and wanted to talk to anybody because he had an enormous curiosity for all of life, and the kinkier the better.
Even though many people were gay in the graduate program, it was not something that was common in general, but certainly not in graduate school, to be clear what your sexuality was.
I mean, I remember him walking around in a little tiny, turquoise tank top with his belly button hanging out. This is Tom.
At Christmas time, there were big parties that all the students would organize, and some of the faculty would come. And there would be either pantomimes or plays. Tom decided that he would be the director of a play. I remember him being a very grand director with a huge flair for theatricality.
He painted tree branches silver, and he had all sorts of things. He was really a Warholian figure.
And this is at the Institute of Fine Arts, which is in the Doris Duke Mansion, and you walk in, and it's this grand, sort of very, very staid Fifth Avenue mansion.
And he just galvanized everybody into a new level of participation. And I think that was one of his great strengths as a museum director as well. He was able to use art to bring communities together.
The Institute was very, very heavy-going academe.
There was a great deal of turmoil, and the Institute was this bubble, sealed off. The Institute's faculty was founded, or at least populated early on, from the emigres from Germany. The general sense is that we were being trained to assume the mantle, and the mantle was very staid and straight.
But on the other hand, it attracted very unique, creative kind of individuals, is how I would describe them.
A whole group of us who were studying art of the 17th, 18th century, we all got grants to go to Europe at the same year. So Tom went to Rome.
He was working on a dissertation, and it was a very scholarly dissertation. And we went to the Vatican Library together and looked through the manuscripts on our respective desks.
But I think Tom became somewhat disillusioned with the academic world.
After the funding dried up, he needed to get a job. So he went the route of taking one-year positions at universities, Kent State, University of Minnesota, and I think also University of British Columbia in Canada. As it turns out in his career, that he made the right choice.
Tom always had a very great interest in museum work. He was hired by the Chrysler Museum in Norfolk, Virginia, and he would give one of his inevitable imitations of someone. He was a great mimic, and he said, "Well, you'll just wait when you come down to the Chrysler and give your talk. You will hear that Mrs. So-and-so will say, 'Ladies, ladies, come to order,' and the gentlemen too."
He'd walk into a room, and the air would leave the room, and there would just be this little pocket of air, this force field around him. And so I always found that people were gravitating to him to get that air.
I don't think anything Tom ever did was traditional.
He wanted people to come into the museum and be affected by what was on the walls.
He wasn't interested in modern art as far when I knew him in graduate school. He was, totally involved in the 18th century in Rome. But boy, that was just the very beginning of a trajectory that was just unending.
Tom's interest in contemporary art was probably always there, but very latent.
When you are trained at the Institute of Fine Arts, which to me was the most intensive and the best training you could ever get as an art historian, we were trained from A to Z.
But it was really more when he got to the Gray Art Gallery that he really came into his own.
There was a real combustion and boom that was so creative, and part of the creative energy was that there was a lot of money available for artists to get grants that would fund them to be able to make art. That disappeared.
The Gray Art Gallery, of course, is NYU's Fine Arts Museum. The administration at that point was looking for somebody with a wide breadth of knowledge.
Basically, the Gray was not on my radar in 1983, 1982.
And as a university museum, I think they valued Tom's scholarship, the fact that he had studied at the Institute of Fine Arts.
What attracted Tom, I think, was New York, and also at the Chrysler, I believe he was chief curator, and in this position he would be director and curator.
It was an amazing period. If I can quote Norman Mailer, it was the golden age of sex, after the pill and before AIDS.
He would come up with shows, and he would come up with just, a statement at a cocktail party that every head would turn.
And I think he showed things that nobody expected there. He really threw the thing upside down, and I think he really had the support of the university.
He came right when the East Village started happening.
By the 80s, you started to get these really strongly developed theoretical thinking artists who knew a lot more about art than the previous generations before them.
One of his first exhibitions here at the Gray was Precious, and it dealt with works from the East Village.
The materials I use in my work, which for years were considered craft or women's materials, he didn't distinguish like that. He saw beyond.
He would introduce work and bodies of work into an institution that it would seem like this is the worst fit ever. He was kind of like trying to get Cinderella's slipper on all the time. And in most cases succeeding, and against a lot of odds.
It was looking at contemporary art from Japan and the artists who were, in a way, reacting against the traditional concept of Japan as cherry blossoms and nature.
The premise was characteristically, for both of us, to upset the traditional models.
Kathy and he had been on a trip to Japan.
It was difficult to show contemporary art in Japan, and he sort of liked that. He liked helping younger artists
We also were very interested in the aftershocks of World War II, which nobody talked about.
He had a reputation of being unafraid of controversy.
So he was interested in making trouble. You know, it felt like my show, you know, when he invited me, he wanted to make some trouble.
It coursed through his veins. He had to. There was something in him that had to provoke.
The great thing about him is that he could manage that controversy personally.
He was not a bureaucrat. He didn't strike me at all as a traditional museum director.
He did not suffer fools. He was incredibly opinioned.
I think Tom delighted in rise, you know, getting a rise out of people, but with a purpose.
That was something that he courted, because I think that he liked to be in a position of controversy, because controversy gets people to think and sometimes gets people to change their mind.
I think he thought that there was a need to speak directly to the ways in which hatred were promulgated in this country and accepted.
He knew his power, you know what I mean? And he didn't always, sometimes it didn't always work, but he wasn't afraid to take advantage of it. When there are things happening in your life that really affect you, you bring it into your work. It's kind of unavoidable.
Since I'm not going to be here in early December, I'm going to be out of New York, so you can weep bitter tears for that already in anticipation of that. I thought I would talk about something that's really sort of near and dear to my heart. I suppose it's my own kind of Lynn Cullen's wild ride. In my case, this was initiated by personal interest and personal biography, but has had implications for the last 25 years.
Well, it entered the New York public consciousness very from the beginning. I mean, New York's like an epicenter for queer culture and gay men. It was sort of strange because there were a lot of people over the years that sort of got ill and were dying, but we didn't really make the connection in a lot of ways, because I think a lot of these people went into hospitals and they didn't really understand what they were. So it was very confusing at the very beginning.
I know this is the first time any of you have had any experience with this, and so we wanted him up here to give us some information and answer any questions any of you might have. Okay,
it was very real to us. We're in the arts. I think we stopped counting when our 52nd friend died. So we were living in a constant state of mourning.
Drug treatment on demand, AIDS won't wait. Drug treatment on demand, AIDS won't wait. Drug treatment on demand, AIDS won't wait.
That was at a time when, those of you who are old enough to remember, was when we first started getting notations in newspapers, a little bit on TV, of the AIDS crisis, when no one exactly knew how infection occurred.
No, artists weren't really studying and internalizing the notion of AIDS, although it impacted so many so directly.
There wasn't a need for it. We were scrambling, we were taking care of ourselves. We weren't thinking about, oh, what are we gonna do to make art about AIDS?
Housing, not shelters. AIDS housing now. Housing, not shelters. AIDS housing now.
And it had no name. You know, we didn't know what those bruise-like marks on his body were. There wasn't a word for Karposi.
The greater art world is a place that avoids contemporary issues.
You couldn't do a show around AIDS. No one would come. They'd get infected from the work. You know, it was that kind of thinking.
You all should keep holding your ground. Keep holding your ground.
Artists take a while to internalize the stimuli that they are receiving.
Museums were losing curators. They knew artists were affected by AIDS, but there was no kind of acknowledgement of it. Museums, as the most stable institution, the most prominent, the ones with the largest reach, were not paying any attention to AIDS, and as a consequence,
it was believed it was a homosexual disease. Queers don't matter. Fuck them. You know, they're the scourge of the society anyways. we're going to get worried and throw money into something to save homosexuals, even though it was a lie.
It left out the fact that people were living with AIDS, not just dying of AIDS. And that was the problem with a great deal of the imagery that was selected by media when they eventually started looking at it.
And it just struck me that all there were these statistics, 8,000 here and 5,000 more. And we decided, all right, what are we going to do?
There were rumblings all around in the art world and in the gay world. There was, you know, there was a noise.
Never be silent again, no, 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 never be silent again.
Tom brought it into the museum world. That was unique.
Which give importance to these new images, to a new lifestyle. But I think, as we've seen, a lifestyle which is not so new, but rather dates back to classical times. Since if we look closely, behind the scenes, behind the backs, we have grasping.
Tom just let me do what I was going to do.
Tom takes great pride in her being the first kind of New York solo show devoted to AIDS images.
Well, I knew that it was going to be a big project. He actually allowed me to edit and sequence everything.
We didn't want to frame any of the images because we didn't want to have sort of like a barrier. They were just sort of hung right on the wall, pinned to the wall.
The ones who could came to the opening and they loved it.
I think Tom's activism was deeply part of him. Like, it wasn't even that he brought it on purpose, it was just part of the way he worked as a curator.
So a group of people met in my apartment with the temptation of my fabulous cooking, and there were 4 people in the art world. And we were not captains of industry. Many of us ran art galleries and smaller organizations. And we found that putting the smarts that we had learned from our educations and our jobs, to a certain degree, I suppose, from our upbringings, we could have made a change.
And they did stuff in those institutions around them, and they pushed them to do that, and they got a lot of pushback for it too.
I was the representative of the biggest museum in the room at that time. So I called a bunch of museum directors across the country, at least 10 or 12 people that I had known from different lives, and said, you know, what do you think? Would you do a moratorium? And they said, to a person, they said, no, that's too negative. But we will do something. I took that information back to the Visual AIDS organization, and we decided to call it Day Without Art, put it on the World AIDS Day, and to let people celebrate it, as it were, memorialize it in any way they saw fit.
Some of them put, shrouds over paintings. Some of them did close, the ones that could.
So the first year we had multiple hundreds of institutions involved, and it was all by basically word of mouth. What I was able to get Bowman to do to participate in the first Day Without Art was a memorial service. So on the day before, on the eve of World AIDS Day, first Day Without Art, David Wojnarowicz read, Leonard Bernstein played a series of pieces that he'd written in commemoration of friends of his who had died.
Symbols are very important. So we thought to provide the larger world with something that they could accommodate and yet could stand out.
In 1990, we debuted the Red Ribbon Project on the Tonys. For years, you could see red ribbons on every awards show.
This costuming is going to be worn today for the Gay Pride March, for the Visual AIDS contingent, for the first Celebrity Ribbon Cavalcade. And they're all costumes that use the red ribbon as the central theme and motif to show our support for people with AIDS, in order to get the word out that America needs to look at AIDS and look at it seriously.
I mean, we were like Red Ribbon Central. We did all the cutting of red ribbons in the beginning, early on, before we could get more volunteers.
If we wouldn't have had Visual AIDS and ACT UP, what would there be? Nothing. Point blank, that's it.
It took the Red Ribbon Project, it took Night Without Light, it took all of these different kinds of things to sort of develop a consensus that was broad enough to make it so that AIDS research became a part of the medical world's, the scientific world's sort of agenda.
There was no concerted effort to do what Tom achieved anywhere in the art world.
Night Without Light and Day Without Art, that's how it got there.
What Tom will be known for is a program, not individual shows, because it was a novel he was writing.
And it shows you that if you have energy, if you're creative, and you learn the conduits of your world, you can achieve anything.
Well, actually, he didn't want to leave the gallery. We were right in the middle of a renovation, and he was approached, he told us, by the Warhol Museum. The reason being is because we did this exhibition years before of the early art and business of Andy Warhol.
By linking Warhol's early work, the commercial work, and showing his huge impact on the world of advertising, prior to him becoming an artist, all of a sudden Warhol became a much fuller picture and started to be celebrated in completely new ways.
And he arrived at the Warhol, and it was fresh and new and a bit down on its luck. This was like perfect for him.
The Andy Warhol Museum started in 1994. It was a triumvirate collaboration between DIA, the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, and the Carnegie Museums of Pittsburgh. And it's very important to remember that in 1994, Andy Warhol's reputation was nothing like it is today.
Warhol at that point may have been perceived as slipping into a celebrity artist.
Over the last decade of his life, Warhol was pretty much universally panned in the art critical realm of the New York art world.
I think what Tom saw, he saw through all that.
Thomas Sokolowski has had a long love affair with the work of Andy Warhol. After mounting the first Warhol exhibition ever in Pittsburgh in the late 1980s, he was named the director of the Andy Warhol Museum last year. Described by many as a real Warholian, Sokolowski claims that in the future Warhol will have the same impact on 20th century art as that of Picasso. I'm pleased to have him here to defend that statement, as well as talk about his own journey and his relationship with Warhol. The same impact as Picasso?
Oh God, without a question. What Picasso was for the first half of the century, Warhol, without a question, is for the second half. And even more than Picasso, he touched film, he helped form the Velvet Underground, rock music, he made movies, he made going out to nightclubs, he did it all. What Andy Warhol understood was how 20th century, the latter part of the 20th century, America in particular, but now the world, looked at itself, how it wanted to package itself, how it wanted to be seen. That's what art does. It takes reality and makes it hyper-reality so we can understand it better.
Tom became a very intriguing part of the fabric of Pittsburgh.
He had a real reputation for the work that he had done at the Andy Warhol Museum, because he had really, for many people, put the Andy Warhol Museum on the map. I mean, all of a sudden, a sort of small, sleepy little organization became this place that was sending shows out internationally.
And he realized that if Pittsburgh could produce Andy Warhol, it can produce a lot more.
I think the whole Warhol phenomenon interested him.
I think by the time he left Pittsburgh, it was a different city.
We have the largest collection of Andy Warhol works anywhere in the world. We're the single largest one-artist museum in America, maybe the single largest one-artist museum in the world.
As soon as Tom left Pittsburgh, it was as though a void had been created, because all of a sudden the provocateur was no longer there to poke and to prod.
His goal was to do what he was supposed to do where he went, to put the places on the map, to let people know what they were doing and how important it was.
Finding his last job, which was at Rutgers, it wasn't an easy ride.
He spent a lot of time alone. He spent a lot of time traveling. But he realized that he needed a forum, and he needed people around him. Zimmerli offered him that, and he thought it was a really interesting challenge.
And having taught for 32 years at a university system, I can tell you, you don't just do what you want to do. You need to have 87 meetings to move the chair across the room. And he was very skilled at working within a university system.
He brought his activism in on day one, and one of the first things he did was change our mission statement. Tom created a 3-part mission statement, and it was that we were an active place, and where we were a diverse place, and where we were a place for the exchange of ideas. And all of that in the service of, let's get to know each other. We think we're so different, but really, are we?
There can be such a divide between Rutgers University and the people that actually live in New Brunswick. We called it top of the hill, bottom of the hill. And Zimmerli Art Museum, though close to the bottom of the hill, was still on Rutgers University campus. So we had to get people up the hill and have them listen to stuff. And we had to make sure that the Rutgers University students attended as well.
I don't know if Tom is what I would expect from someone in the university museum director role, but it's what I would hope for. What Tom really did in his time at Rutgers was start to really activate the space for all that it could be. And a large part of that was being so open to students coming in and saying, hey, I have this thing that I want to do.
There's not a lot of people who operate within the art world, especially fine art, that actually you see them outside. He knew exactly what places to go to in order to run into people.
And he wanted to be part of the community. He didn't live in Manhattan and commute there to work. He lived where he could walk to work, so he could be there as much as he felt he needed to be to make the change happen fast.
I've been coming to the Zimmerli Art Museum since I was a very small child. I'm born and raised in the city of New Brunswick, and this is the only museum within miles and miles. And we came here as often as possible. It was like, I couldn't believe that this existed in the town I grew up in.
The interesting thing about the Zimmerli is that they have such a rich history in that area of New Brunswick with what happened at Rutgers and the critical mass stuff and Fluxus and Siegel and George Brecht and all that. It's rich, rich, rich. And I really think that Tom would have dug into that in a really interesting way.
A lot of the shows that we did while he was here were shows that were unusual for us, but that brought in wide groups of people from the university that hadn't necessarily come to the museum before. We brought the Alison Bechdel show from Vermont. Alison Bechdel is a lesbian comic book writer, and that is front and center in the kinds of comics that she does. And so it was autobiographical, it was funny, it was topical, it was political, it was, controversial. It was all of the things that Tom was interested in. That led us to the Angela Davis show, which was supposed to open in the fall of 2020. And that also was a show that created a lot of discussion at the university and some controversy, but Tom was adamant about it being an important exhibition and it being important for us to show exhibitions that caused a little bit of discomfort because we were an art museum and art museums were places for conversations.
You are reinventing our political universe. Our political universe. You have renewed our collective passion. Our collective passion. You have reminded us. That it is still possible.
And that fact of if you did one thing, if you helped a little old lady across the street, if you gave $100 to the soup kitchen.
At the very least, you move things
forward. Just a little.
For all that bravado and Warholian affinity, he had deep friendships and long friendships.
He always called and wished me a happy Chinese New Year.
Tom Sokolowski was the most loyal friend. He was outrageous, brilliant, funny, and caring.
Tom Sokolowski was all the things that Claudia mentioned, and he was brave. He didn't shrink.
Tom Sokolowski was queer, bold, radical.
He ran to the fire and then carried the fire back with him to those of us that were afraid to run to the fire.
Well, he changed the world. I think with visual aids, he changed the world.
With the possibilities of the museum and the immediate staff that he worked with, he was, I think, in his element.
Oh, I miss his laugh. I can still hear it. I just miss him.
Anyway, I thought I'd get through this without, and you got me. And you can use that.
You know, that kind of life force, I cannot believe when that person dies, however ignominiously or as a gentle death, that life force just goes
gone.
It has to do something.
There's some
now, what it
energy
does,
there,
I don't know.
yeah, I don't either.
When you get older, you do sort of try to put things in perspective and think about, you know, your own life.
Right. I think
and
you do.
what you
I mean, it
leave.
just happens. That's right.
And I don't think that's a bad thing.
The last time I was talking to him, I was like going, oh, you know, money, the terrible situations, the world. I was going on and on about the world. And he said, oh, Irene, come on. He said, you're not down to your last can of tuna fish.
And I distinctly remember Tom sitting next to me, holding a metallic, shiny pen with a sort of troll head hair ensemble on top, floofiness, and it just said Queen with an exclamation point on the pen. And that's when I knew he was somebody that I needed to know.
I think that sometimes Tom would call and I would think, oh my God, I'm in the middle of this. And Tom was a long talker. There were no short calls with Tom. They were long conversations.
I was spared that, thank God.
He always called and wished me a happy Chinese New Year. But he wouldn't talk to me directly. He would just leave this long message on my voicemail saying Happy New Year in Chinese, Gong Hei Fa Choi, and then talk about it because he was very fascinated with, you know, the whole holiday.
He kept touch with all of us. I think we all thought, oh, we're the one getting the call on Sunday. We all were getting the call.